In a busy downtown bank branch, manager Craig Sutter feeds a black small business owner's completed loan application into the shredder in front of her, dismissing her business plan as not the kind of investment this bank makes, while other customers watch in uncomfortable silence. We go back 3 months earlier, revealing Yvonne Price has spent a decade building a small bakery from a rented storefront. Carrying her late grandmother's recipe box as the foundation of the business she's fighting to expand. The bank branch is introduced in cinematic detail. Polished counters, a wall of framed community investment awards, loan officers in tailored suits, and a quiet hierarchy of which customers receive genuine attention. Yvonne is kept waiting far longer than other customers, questioned skeptically about her revenue projections, and mocked subtly for her modest attire despite a flawless credit history and years of steady bakery income. Flashback beats reveal Sutter has a pattern of denying loans to black and minority small business owners while approving similar or weaker applications from wealthier white clients, protected by a regional director focused only on branch performance numbers. A young loan processor named Marcus, who has quietly noticed the disparity in approval patterns, tries to advocate for Yvonne and hints that this has happened before to applicants who couldn't push back. Sutter shreds Yvonne's completed application in front of her, declaring the meeting over and refusing to reconsider despite her calm, detailed rebuttal of his objections. We learn Marcus has been quietly saving digital copies of loan decisions for over a year, and that Yvonne, unbeknownst to Sutter, has already secured a private investment offer for the very building next door to the bank branch. The bank's regional compliance director arrives at the branch months later for an unrelated audit, just as Yvonne returns to formally purchase the neighboring building, and the branch staff realize who is standing in their lobby. Yvonne reveals she secured independent financing and purchased the building next door specifically to expand her bakery, backed by Marcus's saved records proving Sutter's discriminatory lending pattern, now under formal review. Sutter's excuses collapse as the compliance director reviews Marcus's documentation, and Sutter faces suspension and a formal fair lending investigation in front of the very branch he once dismissed Yvonne within. Months later, Yvonne's expanded bakery thrives next door to the bank. Marcus is promoted into a fair lending compliance role, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. This isn't the kind of investment this bank makes. I think we're done here. Craig Sutter fed the last page of Yvonne Price's completed loan application into the shredder mounted behind his desk, the machine's low grinding hum filling the small glass-walled office as the pages disappeared into thin, ruined strips. He didn't look up as he did it, his tone flat and dismissive, as though he were disposing of junk mail rather than 3 months of careful preparation. Yvonne sat across from him, her hands still folded neatly in her lap, watching the shredder consume the business plan she had spent countless late nights perfecting. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply watched, her expression calm despite the sharp, familiar sting settling in her chest. Mr. Sutter, I have 10 years of consistent revenue growth, a credit score above 700, and a detailed expansion plan with projected returns you haven't even asked me to walk you through, she said evenly. I'd appreciate the chance to actually present my case. I've reviewed enough of these small bakery proposals to know how they typically perform, Sutter said, finally glancing up with a thin, patronizing smile. I'm simply saving you the disappointment of a formal denial on your record. A few customers near the teller windows outside the glass office glanced over, drawn by the low hum of the shredder and the tension visible even through the glass. A young loan processor named Marcus Webb, seated at a nearby desk, had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the shredded pages now filling the small bin beside Sutter's desk. You didn't even review the full application, Yvonne said quietly, rising from her chair with quiet, unshaken dignity. But I understand exactly what just happened here. Sutter waved a dismissive hand toward the door, already reaching for his next appointment's folder. I wish you the best with your business, Miss Price. Yvonne gathered her purse and walked calmly out of the office, past the wall of framed community investment awards near the entrance, her expression giving away nothing of what she had just decided in that quiet, humiliating moment. He had no idea what he had just thrown into that shredder, or how completely this single reckless decision was about to change everything about his own career. 3 months earlier, in the small kitchen of a modest rented storefront on the edge of downtown, Yvonne Price had stood before dawn, exactly as she had every morning for the past decade, pulling trays of fresh bread from the oven while the neighborhood outside still slept. Sweet Magnolia Bakery had started as little more than a dream scrawled in the margins of her grandmother Odessa's worn recipe box. A small tin container filled with handwritten cards for cornbread, sweet potato pie, and a particular buttermilk biscuit recipe that had become the bakery's signature item within its first year of business. Odessa had passed away when Yvonne was 23, leaving behind that recipe box as her only real inheritance, along with a quiet, steady belief that Yvonne had repeated to herself through every difficult year of building the business from nothing. Odessa had spent 30 years working as a domestic housekeeper for a wealthy family across town, saving carefully from a modest salary in hopes of someday opening a small bakery of her own, a dream that circumstances and health never quite allowed her to fully realize. She had told Yvonne countless times, over long afternoons spent baking together in her small kitchen, that she wanted her granddaughter to build the business she herself had never gotten the chance to create, a wish Yvonne carried with her through every exhausting year of Sweet Magnolia's early struggles. Yvonne had worked 2 jobs for the first 3 years just to keep the bakery's doors open, slowly building a loyal customer base through sheer consistency and quality, eventually reaching the point where Sweet Magnolia supported her entirely, along with 2 part-time employees she had hired from the neighborhood. For the past year, she had been quietly saving toward an expansion, watching the empty commercial building next door to her current storefront sit vacant for months, imagining the larger kitchen space and expanded seating area it could offer. She had approached 3 different banks with her carefully prepared business plan before settling on Sutter's branch, drawn by its prominent community investment awards displayed near the entrance, a detail that had, in hindsight, felt almost cruelly ironic given what awaited her there. She had brought her grandmother's recipe box with her to that final meeting, tucked carefully in her bag, a quiet reminder of exactly why this expansion mattered so deeply to her. She had no idea, walking into that bank branch that afternoon with 3 months of careful preparation, that she would leave with nothing but shredded paper and a quiet, unshakable resolve that would eventually prove far more valuable than any single loan approval could have been. Sutter's branch occupied a prominent corner of the city's downtown financial district, its polished marble floors and gleaming brass fixtures projecting exactly the kind of institutional stability the bank's marketing materials promised to every community it served. A wall near the entrance displayed framed photographs and plaques celebrating the branch's community investment initiatives, highlighting small business loans and neighborhood development projects the bank proudly claimed to champion. Loan officers moved through the branch in tailored suits, their offices arranged in a row of glass-walled rooms along the building's northern wall, each one visible to the branch floor below, creating an atmosphere of transparency that, in practice, rarely extended to how loan decisions were actually made behind those glass doors. The branch served a genuinely diverse downtown clientele, from small business owners like Yvonne to wealthy real estate investors managing substantial commercial portfolios, though the quality and speed of service each customer received varied considerably depending on factors that had little to do with their actual financial qualifications. Sutter had managed this branch for nearly 8 years, building a reputation with the bank's regional leadership as a reliably strong performer, his branch consistently meeting profitability targets that regional directors valued far more than the qualitative fairness of the individual lending decisions producing those numbers. It was into this polished, carefully curated environment that Yvonne had brought her meticulously prepared application, entirely unaware of just how quickly the branch's celebrated community investment image was about to collide with the reality of how she would actually be treated within its walls. She had no idea how completely this ordinary Tuesday afternoon meeting was about to set in motion a chain of events neither she nor Sutter could have anticipated. The unfair treatment had started subtly, well before the shredder ever entered the conversation, beginning the moment Yvonne arrived for her scheduled appointment nearly 25 minutes early, only to be kept waiting well past her actual meeting time while 2 other customers, both arriving after her, were called back for their own appointments first. "I apologize for the wait," Sutter had said when he finally called her back, though his tone carried little genuine apology. "We had some scheduling adjustments this afternoon." Yvonne had said nothing, settling into her chair and opening her folder of carefully organized financial documents, determined to present her case as professionally as possible despite the frustrating delay. "Walk me through your revenue projections," Sutter had said, flipping through her application with visible skepticism. "These growth numbers seem quite optimistic for a business your size. They're based on 10 years of actual, documented revenue history," Yvonne had explained patiently, pointing toward the relevant page. "The projections are conservative extensions of that established trend, not speculative estimates." Sutter had continued flipping through the pages with the same skeptical expression, occasionally glancing up at Yvonne's simple work clothes with an appraisal she recognized immediately, having encountered similar reactions throughout her years running the bakery. "I have to say, expanding a small local bakery is a fairly risky venture in this current market," he said. "Have you considered whether this business model can really support the debt load you're requesting?" What Sutter didn't notice, absorbed in his own performance of skeptical due diligence, was that Marcus Webb, working quietly at a nearby desk, had paused his own work entirely, watching the exchange with an expression that wasn't simple curiosity. It was recognition of a pattern he had seen unfold in this same office more times than he cared to count. That small detail, a loan processor's careful, quiet attention from across the branch floor, would become the first crack in Craig Sutter's entire afternoon. This was not the first time Craig Sutter had dismissed a qualified minority business owner's loan application while approving comparable or weaker applications from wealthier white clients. And it would not have been the last had the wrong applicant not walked into his office that particular Tuesday. 8 months earlier, a black contractor named Derek Simmons had been denied a business expansion loan despite a credit profile nearly identical to a white contractor whose similar application Sutter had approved just 3 weeks later. A decision Marcus had noticed and quietly documented in his own personal records, uncertain at the time what, if anything, he could do with the observation. 5 months before that, a Latina restaurant owner named Carmen Reyes had been told her business plan lacked sufficient market research, despite submitting a more detailed financial analysis than several white applicants whose loans Sutter had approved that same quarter with considerably less scrutiny. And just 2 months ago, an elderly black homeowner named Frank Coleman had been denied a home equity loan for necessary repairs, with Sutter citing vague risk factors that Marcus, reviewing the file afterward out of growing personal concern, couldn't identify anywhere in Frank's actually quite strong financial history. Each of these decisions had passed through the bank's internal review process without meaningful scrutiny, protected by a regional director named Patricia Vance who evaluated branch managers almost entirely on profitability metrics, showing little interest in the qualitative fairness of individual lending decisions as long as the branch's overall numbers remained strong. Applicants who received these unfair denials rarely had the resources or standing to formally challenge a bank's internal decision-making process, most simply accepting the outcome and seeking financing elsewhere, unaware that their experience matched a quiet, documented pattern repeating itself throughout Sutter's branch year after year. A bank doesn't announce when its lending culture has quietly hardened around exactly this kind of bias. It simply continues operating, application after application, until someone with enough patience and evidence finally forces the pattern into the light. Yvonne Price, watching her application disappear into Sutter's shredder, was about to become exactly that reckoning. Marcus Webb had worked as a loan processor at Sutter's branch for just under 2 years, quietly building a career in banking that he had hoped, when he first started, would genuinely help small business owners in his own community access the capital they needed to grow. Instead, he had spent much of the past year growing increasingly troubled by a pattern he noticed in Sutter's approval decisions. A pattern he had begun quietly documenting in his own personal digital files after realizing that raising formal concerns through official channels seemed to disappear without consequence, protected by Sutter's strong relationship with regional leadership. Watching Yvonne's meeting unfold through the glass wall of Sutter's office, Marcus felt his stomach tighten with a familiar, frustrated recognition. He had processed enough of Sutter's decisions over the past year to recognize exactly the kind of skeptical scrutiny being applied here. Scrutiny that rarely extended so harshly to applicants who happened to share Sutter's own racial and economic background. After Yvonne left the branch, visibly composed despite what had just happened, Marcus found an excuse to step outside briefly, catching up with her near the parking lot. "Ms. Price," he said quietly, "I'm sorry about what happened in there. I've watched this happen before, more than once. I've actually been keeping records, though I haven't known what to do with them yet." Yvonne studied him carefully, surprised by the unexpected honesty. What kind of records? Loan decisions, Marcus said. Approvals and denials, compared against the actual financial qualifications on file. I noticed the pattern about 8 months ago and started saving documentation, just in case it ever mattered enough to matter. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet, careful documentation was about to become the exact evidence needed to finally force a pattern into the open that had been operating undisturbed for far too long. Sutter's dismissiveness, rather than easing after their initial exchange, hardened into open irritation as Yvonne calmly continued addressing each of his stated concerns with detailed, specific rebuttals from her application. Mr. Sutter, if you review page 12, you'll see the conservative debt service coverage ratio I projected, which exceeds your bank's own stated minimum requirements by a comfortable margin, Yvonne said, maintaining her composure despite his mounting impatience. I don't need a tutorial on my own bank's lending standards, Sutter snapped, his earlier practiced politeness finally slipping entirely. I've made my assessment. This isn't the kind of investment this bank makes. With respect, that assessment doesn't seem to be based on the actual numbers in front of you, Yvonne said, her voice remaining level despite the growing tension. I think we're done here, Sutter said, and it was at that exact moment that he reached for her application, feeding it directly into the shredder mounted behind his desk without another word, the machine's low grinding hum filling the small office as 10 years of Yvonne's carefully documented history disappeared into ruined strips of paper. Yvonne watched in stunned, quiet disbelief for a long moment before rising calmly from her chair, gathering her purse and her grandmother's recipe box, her composure remarkable given the deliberate cruelty of what had just happened in front of her. But Sutter had no idea that Marcus, watching through the glass wall of his office, had already begun quietly compiling everything he'd need to formally document this exact incident, adding it to over a year of careful evidence he had been building. The reckoning had already begun taking shape, and it was about to arrive in a form Sutter couldn't have possibly anticipated. What Craig Sutter did not know, what almost no one at that branch knew, was that Yvonne Price, in the weeks following her humiliating meeting, had pursued financing through an entirely different path, one that had nothing to do with Sutter's bank at all. A former customer of Sweet Magnolia Bakery, a private investor named Harold Whitfield who had watched Yvonne build her business over the past decade through countless morning visits for coffee and biscuits, had learned of her denied loan application through a mutual acquaintance and reached out directly, offering to personally finance her expansion in exchange for a modest equity stake in the growing business. Yvonne had spent the following weeks carefully reviewing the offer with an attorney, ultimately accepting terms that allowed her to maintain majority ownership while securing the capital she needed, not just to renovate the building next door to her current storefront, but to purchase that building outright. She had chosen deliberately to finalize that purchase through a small title company located just 2 doors down from Sutter's own bank branch, understanding, with quiet satisfaction, exactly how visible her success was about to become to the very institution that had dismissed her so carelessly. Marcus, meanwhile, had finally found the courage to formally submit his year of documented lending disparities to the bank's corporate compliance office, triggering an internal review that assigned Regional Compliance Director Patricia Vance to conduct an unannounced audit of Sutter's branch, an audit scheduled, entirely by coincidence, for the very same week Yvonne planned to finalize her building purchase next door. The truth about Sutter's lending patterns, and about exactly how thoroughly he had misjudged the woman he had once dismissed so casually, was about to converge in front of his own branch in a way neither he nor his regional director could have anticipated. The bank branch's front doors opened on a bright Tuesday morning 3 months after Yvonne's humiliating meeting, and this time, the woman walking through them carried herself with the same quiet composure, though everything else about the moment had changed entirely. Patricia Vance had arrived at the branch just an hour earlier to begin her unannounced compliance audit. Seated now in the branch's small conference room reviewing loan files with Marcus, who had been specifically requested to assist given his detailed documentation of the patterns under review. Sutter, unaware of the audit's full scope, glanced up from his desk as Yvonne crossed the branch floor, his expression flickering with visible discomfort as he recognized her immediately. "Ms. Price," he said, forcing a thin, uncertain smile. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "I'm not here about the loan, Mr. Sutter," Yvonne said calmly. "I just finalized the purchase of the building next door to my bakery. I thought, Given how close it is to your branch, you might eventually notice the renovation work starting. Sutter's face shifted rapidly from confusion to dawning, uncomfortable understanding. You bought the building? How did you? I secured private financing, Yvonne said simply. The same week you decided my application wasn't worth reviewing properly. Patricia Vance, having overheard the exchange from the nearby conference room, stepped out with Marcus's documentation folder still in hand, her expression sharpening with sudden, focused attention as she connected Yvonne's name to a file she had just spent the last hour reviewing in detail. Ms. Price, Vance said, approaching directly, I believe I need to speak with you as well if you're willing. I'm the Regional Compliance Director overseeing this branch, Vance said, extending her hand to Yvonne. I've just spent the last hour reviewing documentation regarding your loan denial, alongside a pattern of similar decisions made by Mr. Sutter over the past several years. Sutter's face had visibly paled. Patricia, I'm not sure what you've been told, but every decision I've made has been within standard lending guidelines. Standard guidelines don't typically explain why Ms. Price's application, with a stronger financial profile than at least 4 comparable approvals I've just reviewed, was denied without proper documentation, Vance said evenly, holding up Marcus's carefully compiled folder. Nor do they explain why the application itself appears to have been destroyed before any formal denial letter was ever issued, a clear violation of federal fair lending record-keeping requirements. Marcus stepped forward from the conference room doorway. I've been documenting these patterns for over a year, he said, his voice steady despite the visible nervousness beneath it. I tried raising concerns through normal channels initially. I didn't feel they were being taken seriously until I finally submitted everything formally to corporate compliance. I didn't discriminate against anyone, Sutter said quickly, his composure finally cracking under the weight of the mounting evidence. I made a business judgment based on risk assessment. Your business judgment, Vance said, appears to have consistently and disproportionately disadvantaged minority applicants over a period of years, based on the pattern in front of me. That's not a defensible risk assessment, Mr. Sutter. That's a fair lending violation this bank takes extremely seriously. Yvonne stood quietly through the exchange, her composure remarkable given the vindication finally unfolding in front of her, though her focus remained calm and steady rather than triumphant. I didn't come here for this, she said simply. I came here to renovate a building, but I'm glad the truth is finally being taken seriously. The unraveling that followed happened swiftly, in full view of the branch's mourning customers and staff. Vance formally suspended Sutter's authority to process loan applications effective immediately, pending a comprehensive review of his lending decisions extending back several years. A review that would ultimately require the bank to formally reassess and, in several cases, retroactively approve applications that had been improperly denied. I want a full review of every denial in Marcus's documentation, Vance said, turning to address the branch staff who had gathered nearby, drawn by the unusual tension in the room. Every applicant identified in this pattern will be formally contacted and offered a proper reconsideration of their case. Derek Simmons, Carmen Reyes, and Frank Coleman, along with several other previously denied applicants Marcus had documented, would eventually receive formal notification of the bank's review, several ultimately securing the financing they had originally been unfairly denied. Sutter sat quietly at his desk, the same desk where he had once fed Yvonne's application into his shredder, watching his career unravel in front of colleagues who had, until this moment, had little reason to question his authority within the branch. Marcus offered Yvonne a small, relieved smile as the scene settled into its aftermath. I should have said something sooner, he said quietly. You said something exactly when it needed to matter, Yvonne replied gently. That's what counts. Justice, in that branch, arrived not through anger or spectacle, but through one careful year of quiet documentation converging precisely with one woman's determined refusal to let a shredded application define what she could ultimately accomplish. 8 months later, Sweet Magnolia Bakery's newly expanded location opened its doors next door to the very bank branch where Yvonne's original application had once been dismissed. Its larger kitchen and expanded seating area filled on opening day with longtime customers and new visitors drawn by the community's growing awareness of exactly how the expansion had come to be. Craig Sutter was formally terminated following the bank's comprehensive fair lending review. which substantiated a pattern of discriminatory decisions extending back nearly 5 years, affecting dozens of applicants whose cases were subsequently reviewed and, in many instances, retroactively corrected. Marcus Webb was promoted into a newly created fair lending compliance role, tasked specifically with monitoring loan decisions across the bank's regional branches for the exact kind of disparities his own careful documentation had first uncovered, a role he approached with the same quiet, methodical diligence that had once felt like a lonely, uncertain risk. Derek Simmons, Carmen Reyes, and Frank Coleman each received formal apologies and approved financing under the bank's corrected review process, their long-delayed business and home improvement plans finally moving forward with the support they had originally deserved. Yvonne kept her grandmother's recipe box displayed proudly on a shelf near the bakery's new expanded counter, a quiet centerpiece for the business it had helped inspire nearly 2 decades earlier. At the bakery's grand reopening celebration, she stood before a crowd of neighbors and longtime customers and said simply, "They shredded my paperwork, but they couldn't shred what my grandmother taught me about patience and building something worth having. This building is proof of that." Have you ever had someone underestimate what you were capable of building, only to be proven completely wrong? What would you have done, standing in that shredded paper aftermath? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.